The Cognitive Security Institute is dedicated to providing a forum for practitioners and researchers to discuss the fundamental cognitive security challenges of our time. The views expressed by presenters are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of, or endorsement by, the Cognitive Security Institute or any affiliated organizations. Welcome to another presentation of the Cognitive Security Institute. Humanity stands at the threshold of an unprecedented technological revolution. Advances in AI-powered autonomous systems, direct neural interfaces, and immersive digital connectivity promise to redefine human capabilities. However, this transformation also presents profound ethical, security, and existential challenges that demand proactive and thoughtful action. The decisions we make now will shape the trajectory of our species and determine whether we thrive in this new era or falter under its weight. You may learn more about cognitive security and how to become involved in this rapidly growing community by visiting our website at cognitivesecurity.institute. If you find these talks interesting, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. We hope that you enjoy this presentation.
Hello, this is Dr. Matthew Canham, the Executive Director of the Cognitive Security Institute. Over the past year, the world has witnessed a massive increase in the number and capability of AI-enabled social engineering attacks. Ironically, the solution to this emerging threat might be more focus on the human. And that is the focus of today's presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute. We hope that you enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Matt. And I am delighted to be here in a couple of roles with you today. So one is I'm clearly a professor of cybersecurity and strategy at York College of Pennsylvania, and I am very proud to do the work I do to create a future set of leaders in the security space. So that's one element of what I do. And of course, emanating from that is a lot of research around the core of what in security generally in the landscape, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm also here a little bit, although I will absolutely make sure this is not a commercial. I hold a number of patents and happen to be the CEO of a company called CyberCon IQ. CyberCon IQ focuses on human factor cybersecurity and has platforms and tools related to this space. So what I'm trying to do is keep the presentation focused primarily on the theoretical and the conceptual and all the things that I think are important, but I need to stray into my work occasionally just to talk about the differentiation that I believe needs to occur in order to keep humans safe in the age of AI-enabled cyber attacks. So this is a presentation for those of you who are interested in going beyond the checkbox, as we like to say. There is far too much, in my view, pat, simple, one-size-fits-all approaches to security that increasingly are going to show their vulnerability as we move into the scale of AI-enabled attacks that we're already starting to see. And we've seen the thin edge of that wedge, and I'll describe some of that as we go. My primary purpose today in my remarks is to drive some awareness of how the core of behavioral science. So I happen to have multiple degrees. I've never met a degree I didn't like. That's probably true for a number of you in the audience as well. But I have, terminal degrees and a PhD in business. I have a law degree. I have a degree in computer engineering and a degree in ed psych. So I'm a master of many domains, I guess, and I feel that they are blending together at a point in time where it is so important that we begin as a profession to get these things right. So hopefully you'll enjoy this, and we'll go ahead and dive right into it. So I'm speaking, I believe, or preaching, if you like, to the converted here. We are not yet in the age of artificial general intelligence. We can debate how long that's going to come, and we'll do that in a minute or two. And we may, in the discussion, want to talk about the speed with which we forecasted even arriving at the point we are today of generative AI. So there are clearly elements of AI that are rapidly moving into the business sector, and in particular, somewhat into the private sector, somewhat into the public sector as well. In government, we're seeing it. I would argue that the early business benefits are driving adoption of this technology but that the underlying theme is the benefit that tech vendors in particular, and particularly the big 5 tech companies, get from, yet again, the promotion and generally the adopting of technology. So that's an important starting point. We are not yet in the age of AGI. That having been said, rapidly there is the potential for us to get there. And there are those of us who study this and think about this, and again, I'm not yet engaged in a conversation with you, but I hope to after the presentation, that the distinction is not only worth making, but the distinction has a lot to do with the risk profile of AI technologies as a whole. And the closer move to true AGI, perhaps the more dangerous the risk to all of us on the planet becomes. And so if you agree with that hypothesis that we are not yet in the age of AGI, but the closer and the more rapidly we move towards that, the risk profile for AI and its impact on security dramatically shifts. And we see that hockey stick, that sort of hyperbolic curve that is so frequently the case in any new technology. So if we do that, it leads us to this concept. And for some of you, this may be new, but I would imagine for most of you, it isn't. And this is P, the probability of doom. And why does this matter? And I want to be careful not to sow the seeds of fear here, because I'm going to return in a second to why I think we're not quite there. But P-doom is essentially this idea of the percentage, the probability chance of AI having a catastrophic event that essentially wipes out humanity or humanity's control over a technology that it gave birth to. I think this matters when we get closer to the age of AGI as opposed to GAI, which is the age we're in now. But I also hope that I'm essentially preaching to the choir here, because I think you already know about this. In fact, I would suggest we've all had a sense of really knowing about this for several years, even before AI tools became more widely available. Many of us in this profession were already beginning to understand that we had hit the boundary where the technology perimeter defenses in particular, and if we think about the sort of the tactical edge of what we think about as our responsibility for security, once we'd secured our perimeter with all of the technology and tools that we needed to, we had a sort of self-satisfied sense that we had accomplished something in security. And then we began to watch the attack surface begin to change even before we had general availability of AI. And we began to understand that human factors were not programmable. Humans are not machines. And we already were starting to dance around this in 2020 and 2021 with the arrival of COVID and the massive push towards distributed computing and working from home and all of the stuff about BYOB and BYOD and it's all BYOB everything. And fascinating that we began to see that the successful attacks all had a human element. To prove that hypothesis for just a second, I would say a word that now strikes terror in most cybersecurity professionals' vocabulary: CrowdStrike. And I say CrowdStrike because it was an excellent example of an open API that connected a trusted vendor, a third party that for many of us was an important part of our technical defenses, directly to the device's root operating system. We enabled this access with a vendor that we felt was secure, and a single mistake by a single human in the release of an update caused a massive wave of really disruptive repair to technology, where we had to go put our hands back onto actual computers. We couldn't repair it remotely. We couldn't undo the damage. There was no rollback. And we began to understand that that human factor was absolutely able to bring our reliance on that technology to a point of devastating consequence. So we know this and think we understand this. So if we then understand that as the realm of the really important advances that are going to happen in security in the future, then protecting humans from themselves becomes essentially our destiny as security practitioners. And because the humans aren't nearly as predictable, reliable, programmable, we're not built for compliance in some ways, it becomes a question of human nature. So let me begin with some actual strategies that I think can be helpful for us all to collectively begin to change the trajectory of the global conversation. And we have to do this in a way that moves us off of fear, because when I opened, there may have been this niggling fear and anxiety. But that niggling fear and anxiety is a biophysical reaction. It's the classic fight or flight. And it's all that stuff that I've written about in my books and talked about in my articles. That is not a helpful response, a human response. And what is really important is that we help move this conversation away from sowing fear and driving that stasis, that constant low level of fear that triggers a biological condition called hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is one step below fight or flight, but biologically and biophysically, it makes us more vulnerable, not less, and less able to actually reframe and rethink and retool as humans in the face of this accelerating threat landscape that's AI enabled. So how do we get from fear into hope? And I want to focus on just a couple of examples on this slide. One of my favorites is the phrase zero trust. So if I were to say to, for instance, my very dear trusted colleague and friend, Tammy Schwartz, who I work with at the college, if I were to say to Tammy, I have zero trust in you, she might be initially quite offended. But of course, we don't mean zero trust in the sense of our personal trust one to the other. What we really want to make okay socially is the idea, in my view, of absolute assurance. This idea that yes, we trust, but we verify before we trust, because how do I really know when I'm in a technologically intermediated zone, whatever that zone is? How do I know it's really Tammy? And how do we make it socially acceptable for us to imagine that we have a responsibility to each other in order to perpetuate the trust that we have, to move into a model of absolute assurance, because there are people who are always at our perimeter who are willing to disrupt that, exploit that, and use that in order to create a negative outcome for us. So it is a personal responsibility not to assume trust, but to make sure that trust is earned and maintained and assured. That would be a classic example. How do we work with the people watching this video today? If you're watching this YouTube, how do I convince you personally to move away from the idea of choosing convenience and living in a post-private world where frequently you don't seem to care much about your own privacy, to actually demanding security and privacy, where the premium we put on this as a society is no longer optional, but actually returns us to this idea, just as we learned in CrowdStrike, we had to have technical support people that knew how to go into the command line and the root and do things that we haven't had to do in a long time because we had an over-reliance on technology. Technology won't keep us safe. And we have to make sure that we as humans accept that and that it becomes a social stricture that's okay. And you demand security from your technical vendors. The big five have got to learn that they cannot take our privacy rights away from us. So we could go on and on and on, how we move from fear to skepticism, how we stop measuring inputs. This is another great one. It isn't about what we do anymore. It's about whether what we're doing is actually having an intended outcome. Can we measure it? Do we understand it? And how do we hold everybody who holds our information accountable for telling us what they're doing to actually maintain that in a world of AI-enabled cybersecurity threats? Because the bad guys are getting AI long before the defenders are developing strategies that are going to work. And we'll talk about that near the end of this presentation today. So I think those are some examples. And I think we have some real work to do as thought leaders in this space. And I'm counting on this group to be a thought leader in this space to really help transform that conversation from fear into hope. So now let's get into some specifics of what we, in my view, need to do as a profession. And something really interesting happened of note this year. And what happened was that for the first time since 2014, NIST, which to a large extent is the de facto, if you like, security standard framework for North America, sponsored by the US government, widely seen. It underpins what we do in Canada to a large extent. It underpins what we do with CMMC in the defense and the DIB sector. And we could go on and on and on. But the point is, NIST at least gives us some indication, a lagging indicator, of what the regulatory and legal stance is around some of the future of security. And what they did this year is they elevated the idea of governance out of the old 5 and created a super, sort of a meta, if you like, a meta domain over all of the standard that returned us to the idea that risk was not, technical security risk was not a technical issue, but a governance issue. And it returned us to beginning to think about cybersecurity as being a permanent, persistent business risk, one that we needed to govern all the time, actively, and we needed to do so across the whole of the enterprise or the whole of government. And we could no longer just assume that the risk emanated from our technical architecture. This very significant shift in NIST 2.0 has also, I think, begun to drive into most people's thinking the idea that collective security, that culture of security, is actually derived from the individual perceptions and attitudes and behaviors of each individual inside the culture. And we've always known this, by the way. In business schools, Tammy and I and others will tell you, and any of you who are on this call who study this, will tell you that the idea of organizational sociology, organizational behavior has been with us for a long, long time. Since probably post-World War II and Deming and going back to all this stuff, we've understood that when we work at culture as an individual, as the building block being the individual, and we build up from the individual to the culture we want, that we are more certain to get that. And I think what's happening now is the idea of security and security first, especially in the age of AI-enabled cybersecurity attacks, requires that we implement and instill a culture of security and privacy and data governance and all the things that we have to deal with at the enterprise or government-wide level. And as we move towards that, and as regulators begin to understand that we need to prove that what we're doing, the inputs, can actually have a measurable impact on creating this goal of a security culture and the individual behaviors of the individual, we're not forcing compliance out of fear, but we're doing so proactively and out of a sense of personal responsibility to contribute to maintaining the security of the organization. We are going to get a shift in the results from all of our efforts internally in security. So this is something that I think is really important. Starting to focus on the last little bit of that slide, focusing on the behaviors, attitudes, and norms which surround technology use in your organization and extending it out to take into account that the tactile edge of what you do now needs to incorporate all of your trusted third parties in addition, all of your vendors, all of your interconnected APIs, all the folks you SSO with, and so on. It has a much more comprehensive understanding of what security is and what we're trying to do at the perimeter. Now we have some early vendors moving this space. Some of you know SAFE and some of the FAIR methodology, Security Scorecard, BitSight, UpGuard, Risk Recon, there's a bunch of them. So there's increasingly a sense that we need to measure and manage security. And if we do that, it would seem to me that if the past was cybersecurity as a technical risk, and the future is a strategic perpetual business risk, then we also need to incorporate behavioral analytics and behavioral science into what we're doing, because each of the examples shown above, whether you're talking about security measure management or data and privacy and governance, still are for the most part focusing on this idea of the technical elements. And I worry that we haven't added enough of the human factor analysis to quantify real behavioral risk in order to get to the point where we have an understanding of what the true risk profile of our organization is. And as we integrate back into ERM, into traditional enterprise risk management, other parts of the risk that businesses face, we have a much steadier understanding of, because we have decades of actuarial data that studies what the risk looks like and feels like, and what are its inputs and its outputs and its possible mitigating factors, and what are the procedures and policies and practices we need to have in place to minimize and mitigate those risks. And we've studied all of this in detail. We now have to restudy our understanding of cybersecurity in an AI age, because as we move away from understanding it as a technical risk and a risk at the perimeter and begin to see it as a pervasive business risk, we need to incorporate the human element. And that is, as we've talked about, less predictable, and in some ways makes us a little bit uncomfortable, because we're going to have to develop the same kind of reliable actuarial understanding of human behavior in a security context that we have in all other parts of risk in the enterprise. So we're going to have to create these actuarially sound data-driven risk equations that we have in all other parts of what we do. And we call this in our practice cybermetrics, the idea that we need to understand how to measure potentiality. That is, what is our likely risk of a breach at any point in time when we compare all of our defensive tactics, including human factors mitigation of risk, in a threat landscape that is constantly changing and advancing. And as we look at the dynamic nature of the threat landscape that's out there, and as we adjust our defenses to match the fact that the folks who are attacking us are going to be using more sophisticated, higher quality, easily more scalable threats, how do we also scale our defenses to match? And how do we measure that gap? And how do we measure the cost of an event? Because whether we're talking about insurance, whether we're talking about risk tolerance profiles, I mean, both the SEC and NIST now say we have to get to a place where as an organization, we understand what our risk tolerance is. And it has to be a specific tolerance for a level of risk because we understand we can't get the risk to zero. It's impossible. So because we can't get the risk to zero, we know that the risk is present. It is always there. The question is, what degree of risk is acceptable for us to run and why? What is our risk tolerance? And once we've established what our potential risk tolerance is and the likely cost of that event, we can use an actuarial equation, which is the probability of the event times its cost to give you an imputed value at loss, value at risk. And this is an insurance concept we've had for a long, long time. If we were successfully attacked, whether that was an AI vector or something else, what would that likely cost look like? And not just, by the way, the hard remediation costs, because we can estimate those with some certainty based on the scope of the types of data we have, the number of places we operate, what the regulatory frameworks are, and so on, whether we're in healthcare or banking, critical infrastructure, highly regulated, someone with fines like HIPAA, or whether we're in less regulated industries. We can do all that. What we can't often assess is the reputational harm, the soft costs, the lack of trust, the erosion of confidence that having a successful breach has when increasingly we can no longer keep those, especially for a publicly traded company. We're now forced to disclose those. And as those events and disclosure of those becomes a public fact of life, we face both hard and soft costs of remediation that are going to make multi-million-dollar breaches look like child's play. So we really do need to get a grip on this and understand this. So a little bit of commercial. I've got a couple of patents that are have already been approved in the US and the UK. I've got one patent that's just come through examination in Canada. So this is actually work that I've done in my work as an academic developing these. And I don't know whether Tammy's on the call, but if she is, she had an early hand in doing early versions of some of what I'm about to talk about. And the reason I say this is because there are very few patents in this particular category. This is a business process patent in the US that combines technology, if you like, the actual tools and methods with a business use case that proves impact in order to get this. So this is not training gizmos and gadgets and all that stuff. This is a core, an understanding of how we get to the idea of how somebody's security instincts and behavior are tied to specific interventions. This is an important thing we need to do. And my entire model is based on this idea that our risk versus rule inclinations explain a large part of each individual's behavior in front of any particular online vulnerability or threat. So our security behavior in my world is actually based on trait-based personality theory. It's the idea that there is not a universal level of vulnerability to a threat, but that it's actually personalized to our instincts and impulses. Now, at a human level, I liken this to teaching children to cross the street. Any of you who are parents or aunts or uncles or whatever you are to young children know that you are going to repeat a phrase to a child 1,000,000 times before it becomes a habit. And that is, look both ways before you cross the street. We have to absolutely replace the instinct and the impulse of the child to run out into the street following the ball they just kicked so they won't get killed by an oncoming car. Well, that analogy has some resonance in security because that whole world of cyberspace, that ethereal sort of thing, is full of temptations and full of new things and things we don't yet understand and things that are being thrown at us. It's really kind of tempting. We may just run out and embrace it all. And so that idea of our impulses and instincts, the degree to which somebody is risk tolerant, if not even risk seeking, as opposed to risk averse, has been present in trait-based personality theory for decades, and we understand it. And many of the tools that you're familiar with, Myers-Briggs, DISC, and MMPI, and a whole bunch of other psychological tools can give you some understanding of, in your core personality, how you are on risk. And if I just said to each of you right now to think about how you would characterize yourselves from incredibly risk averse and a score close to 0, that is, I run no risks and I absolutely won't do that, all the way up to, whoa, I love that. I'm a skydiver. I'm a cave diver, whatever. You know that about yourself. This has a lot of implication for how vulnerable you may be in the face of certain kinds of threat vectors. Certain kinds of threat architecture is going to be more vulnerability making for you than other ones. The other dimension of the model, and these are just playful names, by the way, breakers, takers, makers, and shakers. We try and make this accessible and safe. We don't want people to feel like they're being profiled and bad. So there's no bad style. There just is a style. We all fall into the spectrum somewhere. And then the idea of rule breaking versus rule following or rule abiding. And the test I use for this in a lot of cases is to say to people, let's get outside of the security realm, because this has absolutely, this model, nothing to do with what you know about cybersecurity best practices. In fact, I want to run the other way from that, because in our research, many of the people who presuppose that their knowledge of security, so professionals like us on this call who study this, do this, who are security professionals, sometimes take for granted this stuff more than we should. So I don't equate knowledge of security practices and best practices even with risk avoidance or the ability to avoid being vulnerable necessarily. But go back to the model for a second. So think about the kind of car you drive and your driving habits. Think about entering an interstate nearby to you, and then imagine 3 lanes. There are those hugging the right-hand side and who literally will merge at or below the speed limit and will continue to move at or below the speed limit. There's the middle lane, kind of moving with traffic, and you think you feel safe from the consequences of breaking the rule because you're probably going above the posted speed limit, but not so much above it that you feel like it's a risk yet. So, you know, you're combining a couple of things here. You're combining the idea of autonomy, that is control to choose the lane you're in, with also a degree of authenticity, of whether or not you want to be discovered or seen breaking the law, because the people in the far left lane, the speedsters who are setting the pace, are the ones who you believe face the most consequences for breaking the rule. So we have these idea of transparency and autonomy, which are overlaid with the core elements of risk and rule. And at both the individual level, which we call MyQ, and at a cultural level, we can begin now to map our understanding of what the DNA of risk is in the organization, because the culture, the security culture of the organization, is built up from the individuals contained in the enterprise, and is built up from their understanding of their own behavior and their genuine willingness in the moment to adapt and adjust their own behavior in the face of vulnerability and threat. So the culture is changed by understanding how we influence the decisions made by the individuals in the moment to comply or not with all of the controls that we've put in place. Because what we do know is all of those wonderful controls that are dictated to us by whatever control framework we pick, NIST, ISO, CMMC, CIS 20, now 17, whatever we do, all of those, our humans can choose to work around frequently. So compliance can't be mandated. It has to be encouraged, cultivated, and instilled using a lot of behavioral science. Now, another key difference that I want to focus on today, that especially for this crowd, I think you'll find really interesting, is so many of the tools I made reference to before, and so much of what we do, is a fairly basic level of behavioral science called UBA, or user behavior analytics. This is the idea that we establish normal, in quotes, by identifying a baseline of how people are behaving today and using a reactive approach to detect anomalies and reporting the anomalies and subjecting them to some form of additional elevated scrutiny or investigation. This is a very simple part of behavioral science. In fact, it barely touches really at the core of behavioral science. But I want to point out that it is a highly reactive approach, and it tends to drive an enormous problem in the security profession. And that is, it will drive a huge number of false positives into the SOC. And those false positives all trigger the need for triage and analysis. And one of the things we teach at your college is, how to do threat analysis and how, an analyst might be approaching this. And your most expensive asset in security is the talented human being who understands what to do, who is going to use human judgment to analyze these IOCs, these incidents of compromise or concern, and establish whether they are false positives, whether they are slight deviations from normal, or whether they indicate hit the panic button because we have an early indicator of a really bad event. So UBA is frequently already in use, especially by my more sophisticated clients, but it's really not very effective. But it's all we've pretty much traditionally had. In an age of AI-enabled cyber, I think we're going to have to rapidly move over to PBA, which is a very different idea. It is the idea that we take a proactive approach by attempting to preempt the security threat. That is, to get the human to behave differently so they don't even trigger the IOC in the first place. And this comes from that security and behavioral patterning and what we have to do in order to establish preventative measures that create adaptability and resilience in the face of vulnerability, so that the human voluntarily changes their behavior in the face of that threat in the moment to even avoid us getting to the IOC in the first place. So psychology matters, and it may matter more than technology. In my world, I think we need to get to the point where we are starting to combat that situational distractedness. If you were to look at your desktop right now in this very moment of this webinar that we're doing together, I expect you have email things blinging, multiple windows open. Like we live in a world of highly distracted workflows. And so in any moment, if we want to be vigilant, we have to be aware that those threats often come at us in a compressed world where the ability to remediate our response to that risk can be impaired by situational distractedness. And so a lot of the models that I think are going to start to emerge are going to be less the hitting the panic button to report the phishing email, which yet again is false, because some of the people who are so risk averse are going to hit that button every single time for every single thing that happens and create another set of long streams of queues of false positives, to preempting them and deciding that for the moment that they're in, they have to self-assess the situation and choose a course of action that is informed. And that the hardest thing we have to do is pattern interrupt. And in psychology, it's one of the biggest things we have to do. We have to in the moment get the person to first stop. That is the hardest thing. And it's the thing we work at hardest at CyberCon IQ, is getting them to stop and not tip over the edge of the beginnings of that attack. And that is really, I think, where we're heading in cyber. To do that requires all of these steps and requires the idea of a consequences framework. And the fact of the matter is that I can get just about any client to their lowest theoretical possible level of what we call residual resistant risk. And in psychology, there are people for whom no amount of training, no amount of knowing is going to change their behavior. So the idea that we can simply train away this problem is misplaced. We can do security awareness training all day long, stuffing information into people's heads about what they should know and should do. That doesn't mean they're going to do it. It's back to the idea of inputs and outputs. The real question is, how do I identify the percentage of my population that's very valuable to the enterprise, by the way? We need those people, but they are consistently not going to do what we tell them. They're going to misbehave in the face of risk, and they represent the kernel of the largest component of the risk in the organization. And then I have people say to me, well, we can't profile our people. Well, you're going to have no choice. Because in the age of AI-enabled cyber, if you can't profile why they're vulnerable and how they're vulnerable, and you can't determine whether or not they can be taught to be resilient in the face of that, then you will not be able to achieve a benchmark level of risk and risk tolerance in your posture that your organization is willing to run. And when the attacks happen, and they will happen, and when they come, you will not have the legal defenses necessary to stay out of jail. You are going to be in real trouble because the class action lawsuit will prove that there was more you could have done that you didn't do, and you voluntarily chose not to do it. Now, this does not for me, lead to the conclusion these people are bad. They're not inherently bad. In fact, some of the skills they have may be absolutely vital to the organization's success and its strategy. but we have to decide when we get to the point where some other kind of intervention is necessary. Beyond coaching, it might be selective controls, reducing access. I mean, you have to decide, each of you in your organizational roles, what those are. But I can tell you that to get to a level of risk that's tolerable in the face of this ever more sophisticated attack surface, we are going to have to approach some of these, because training alone will be insufficient. So to finish on a high note, we don't yet have the answers. And I noticed that there are 6, not 5, and it should have said 6 because I added one that I found yesterday. So my apologies for the inconsistency in the numbers. But here are 6 suggestions for some things that are starting to emerge that are the beginnings of what we can do today. Now, none of this is a one-size-fits-all prescription for you have to do these, or the extent to which you do these, or the depth to which you do these. But some of these should be obvious to us as practitioners, and they become more important to deploy at scale with the change in the AI threat environment. So these emergent early best practices, and I'm not going to cover them all, but I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights. So one is clearly embedding AI augmented tools into our own defenses, because if the imbalance exists that the cyber criminals get access to and deploy the AI technologies before we as defenders can organize our response and get the resources and support from the organization we need to embed these, that imbalance of access to these tools creates a very large latency gap. And so we have to close that gap as defenders, and we have to be able to adopt the forms of AI that are going to be helpful in detecting and remediating these attacks that are coming at us more quickly, and using the AI tools to help. So that's an example. I need not comment on the increasing need for enhanced data protection and privacy controls, especially in an AI-enabled age. I want to focus a little bit on encryption. Encryption still stands as a very important part of what we do. I know it introduces a lot of friction. Not all vendors can support it. It's got lots of issues. But the bottom line is, if the data that is eventually stolen in an AI-enabled attack is encrypted, then it is not a reportable attack event. And it's really important to distinguish now the differences between an attack versus a reportable breach or attack, because of the public disclosure laws. So number 3 is a very important thing for those of you, especially working in publicly traded companies, or companies that fall under regimes where you have to make disclosures public, like in healthcare to HIPAA and have fines. That becomes a really important tool. Really enhancing and doubling down on IAM. We're going to be using lots of behavioral biometrics, lots of other tools. They're already available, but we're really going to increasingly have to move to a world where we watch for immediate variations in the access of somebody, and the identity is not them, it's a manipulated identity. So we've had a hijacking of the ID, or we have posturing, imposing, whatever. So we have to watch that carefully. Zero trust or enhanced or elevated assurance we've talked about. And then fostering this idea that we are going to have AI and IQ working together, a collaboration. And how do we do that? And how do we make sure in the end that IQ always stays in charge of AI? So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say I want you to enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for spending some time with me today and for enabling this important conversation to follow. My contact information at the college is there. I'm always happy to make any kind of contact with people who are in this profession, who are trying to lead in a very dangerous age. We don't want it to be dangerous. We want it to be safer. But to do that, we all need new approaches to security in an AI-enabled age. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute. You may learn more about topics in cognitive security by visiting us at cognitivesecurity.institute.